Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of videos accompanying the AQA Unit 2X, The Making of Modern Britain. And this is the first of our videos on the 1970s and specifically on Edward Heath's Conservative government, which lasted from 1970 through to 1974. And in this video, we're going to look at Heath coming to power, a little bit about who Heath was as person and as a politician. We're going to look at his government's approach to and record on the economy. We're going to look at industrial relations, particularly the miners' strike and three-day weeks, and also briefly at the fall of the Heath government in the first of the two general elections in 1974. So, first of all, let's have a little look at Heath in 1970. So in 1970, we've got the election. We've just had 6 years of Labour government under Wilson from 1964 through to 1970. And Heath is there as leader of the opposition. Now, Heath has decided that 1970 is time for a change. It's time for a break with 25 years of what we've referred to as the post-war consensus. Just a reminder about what the post-war consensus was. If you remember that between 1945 and 1970, whether we have a Labour government or a Conservative government, there's broad agreement over a wide range of policies. Now, the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Conservative Party were not necessarily that happy with this, but the majority of people within both Labour and Conservative governments in this period share broad agreement on a number of areas. For example, support for significant spending on the NHS, support for a strong welfare state, involvement of both employers and trade unions in economic policy making, the mixed economy, a mixture of privatised and nationalised industries, as well as general support for some key areas of foreign policy, including decolonisation, a recognition of the special relationship, and quite a lot of increasing support for EC membership as well. All of that formed part of the post-war consensus. But on an economic level, it's become clear by 1970 that whatever else people think of the consensus, it certainly hasn't solved all of Britain's post-war economic problems. In particular as well, the idea that bringing the trade unions into policy making will help to smooth over industrial relations, that hasn't really come off. And actually, in the late 60s, we have lots of strike action, particularly in 1967, 68. And even the Labour Party is beginning to say, look, we need to think carefully about trying to reform industrial relations. You might remember Wilson and Castle's failed attempt in 69 in place of strife to bring in some trade union reform. So that side of the consensus is increasingly under threat. Even the Labour Party is beginning to question that. And increasingly, particularly Heath and the Conservatives, starting to say we need to look again at elements of the consensus in order to turn the economy round. Although left-wing Labour MPs wouldn't agree with Heath about much, they also criticise the consensus. They say, look, in terms of poverty, that remains. Poverty absolutely hasn't gone away because of 25 years of consensus politics. Now, they may have a different solution to Heath, but there's this growing sense that the consensus needs to be reviewed and needs to be amended. And so we have Heath and we have the shadow cabinet coming into the 1970 election, beginning to say we've got to break away from the consensus. We've got to ask big questions about the role of the state be getting so involved in the economy. We've also got to question another big aspect of the consensus, which is full employment. Heath is beginning to say, look, is some unemployment actually okay if it brings down inflation? So there are some big questions being asked by Heath as we approach that 1970s. Now, in terms of the election itself, the Conservatives get an okay majority. It's certainly not a landslide, but it's not slim either. It's 30. It's okay. Heath becomes Prime Minister. The Conservatives have 330 seats. Labour 287. 6 years of Wilson have now come to an end. There is an element of surprise. You might remember that Roy Jenkins had done quite a bit after the devaluation to stabilise the economy when he became Chancellor. Wilson if you remember, was hugely good on television. He was a popular campaigner. He was very experienced, far more so than Heath. And yet the Conservatives win. Now, Heath himself had always been convinced he could do it. And increasingly, the voters have put their trust in him. Heath might not be the kind of charismatic figure that Wilson is, but he gives an impression of being competent, of potentially being good at his job, of being hardworking and conscientious. And it's only 3 or 4 years since the real economic turmoil that the Wilson government faced. And voters may have short memories, but they're not necessarily that short. Now, interestingly, another thing that has played into Heath's hands is the Enoch Powell affair. Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, hugely controversial, of course. Now, on the one hand, quite a lot of voters had supported Powell over that, and in their mind, Powell is a Conservative. We like Powell, therefore the Conservatives are good. So that benefits the Conservatives. Equally, of course, Heath had sacked the shadow cabinet, and there are other voters who think, God, Heath is a good man. He's done the morally right thing. He's a decisive man. He's acted firmly. We like Heath. We'll vote Conservative. So in a paradoxical way, the Powell affair, as controversial as it was, has benefited Heath in two separate ways. And it's also the case as well that when Heath says it's time to move away from the consensus to an extent, that chimes with quite a lot of voters too. And the Conservatives' manifesto, it's drafted at the Selton Park Hotel in January of 1970, very much puts that front and centre, the idea that it's time for a change. So reforms to the tax system, a tougher approach to law and order tends to go down well with a lot of voters. Union reform, as we've said, cuts to spending, controlling immigration. And the really big one as well, Heath increasingly says, look, there are certain industries that we tend to call lame duck industries that are failing, that are on the last legs. And he says for too long, governments have propped these industries up, they've pumped money into them, when really failing industries should be allowed to wither away, because ultimately they're failing because they're not very efficient, they're not very effective, and ultimately the government shouldn't be propping them up. He says these lame duck industries should not be saved because they're damaging the economy. And that policy suggestion is quite on in some quarters. A little bit more about Heath as a person and as a politician as well. So Heath's an interesting character. Again, remember, we're living in a different world. Even in 1970, he's the first ever Conservative leader not to have been to private school, the first one from a state school. He's also, and again, this is really quite interesting, the first Conservative leader to have been elected by Conservative MPs. Before then, you would get a few upper-class men in a smoke-filled room having a discussion, and then suddenly, have chosen Harold Macmillan. A Conservative leader would emerge. Actually, Heath has been elected democratically by a vote of Conservative MPs. So he represents, in different ways, a new era. But as we've said, when you compare him with Wilson, he's not brilliant in the media. He's a little bit awkward and aloof even, and prickly almost when he's talking to members of the public. But having said that, Heath is conscientious. He keeps his focus on policy. Wilson, we've said this before, is almost paranoid, isn't he? He's convinced his colleagues are plotting against him. Wilson sees politics like a soap opera, really. But ultimately, Heath is different. He's very focused on policy. He's serious. He presents an image of competence. Interestingly, that can work both ways. Some of his colleagues actually say, look, we want Heath to be a bit more like Wilson. He should be kind of schmoozing us and trying to win us over. He should be out there in the media putting a positive spin in his policies. We don't want him being too honest. So even that side to Heath gets some criticism. But what we can say for sure is that Heath has appealed to the voters in 1970. And as he becomes Prime Minister, something else we can say about him is he's very well prepared for the job. He spent a long time, 5 years is a pretty long time as leader of the opposition, from 1965 onwards, and he spent that time working hard to really develop his economic policies, about moving away from the consensus, developing some pretty comprehensive policies on the trade unions. Another really key aspect to Heath, and we'll explore this more in a foreign policy video another time, is that Heath is a passionate pro-European, and he's also an expert on applying to the EC. Although Macmillan's negotiations had failed in '63, Heath had been his chief negotiator, so he brings a wealth of experience on European policy to the job. Having said all of that, what we then go on to say about Heath is if you look at his government as a whole, the aspect of the economy and industrial relations, it really is a very difficult 4 years, both for Heath and the Conservatives and also for Britain. Now, it's not all negativity. There are some quite significant reforms that the Heath government introduced that have lasted, that were popular, that felt like the right thing. He reorganises local government, streamlines it to an extent. The school leaving age goes up to 16, and decimalisation comes in under Heath as well in 1971. You may not know loads about the old British currency of pounds, shillings and pence. Certainly you need to be good at your 12 times table. There were 240 pence in a pound, for example. Decimalisation brings in a system of currency that we know today, far more straightforward, where you only really need to know your 10 times table. So some really important modernisation going on under Heath. But if we look at the real details of Heath and the economy, there are some really quite significant problems. So we get, in the first year of Heath, this break with the consensus. This is what Heath was promised in the manifesto. It's known as the Selsdon programme. That's where the manifesto was drafted. And Anthony Barber, who's Heath's Chancellor, puts this into place. Taxes are cut, public spending is cut, and we end up with what we call the Barber boom. Inflation begins to go up. Obviously, taxes are down. People do potentially have more money in their pockets. Wages and prices rise. And the idea was, as that happens, the economy will grow. But we end up in a weird position where actually that doesn't happen. And as inflation grows, unemployment grows as well. Now, you might remember in the stop-go era, you either had rising inflation or you had rising unemployment. You didn't really have both of them together. The idea that more and more people are unemployed and prices are going up at the same time is a new one, and it's a pretty disturbing one, and it's known as stagflation. Brilliant word, combination of stagnation and inflation. The economy is suffering quite significantly. And all of a sudden, after all this heralding and breaking away from the consensus to save the economy, actually things seem to be getting even worse. Unemployment gets almost to 1 million, and by post-war standards, that is very high. And what we get, and this is a really significant thing, is what we call a U-turn. Imagine Heath driving his little governmental car. All of a sudden, he screeches it back around in the other direction. And all of a sudden, Heath moves back towards consensus politics. Remember, Heath had talked about struggling firms, calling them lame duck firms. All of a sudden, Rolls-Royce are nationalised, brought under government control. The Upper Clyde shipbuilders, which would have been seen as the lame duck once upon a time, Heath pours government money into those so they don't go bankrupt. All of a sudden, Heath has gone straight back to consensus politics. Now, Heath, who's a clever man and quite a subtle man, says, look, I was always a one nation conservative. I was never on the far right or even the right. I'm a moderate politician. I agreed with lots of aspects of the consensus. All I'd ever said was that we need to consider breaking away from elements of it. So Heath justified his U-turn. He says, look, here is the reality on the ground. Unemployment is going up and I had to act. I was never fully about breaking away entirely. But a lot of the Conservatives, a lot of the media look at Heath and go, well, yes, you were. You put it in the manifesto. You said that you were breaking away from the consensus, and all of a sudden, what have you done? You've gone straight back. It is a U-turn. And quite often, you could argue, we could look at a U-turn and go, it's a sign of being sensible. Unemployment's gone up. Yes, we're going to have to acknowledge we need to do things differently. Some people would say it's a sign of being honest, of being mature. But for a lot of people in the Conservative Party, a lot of people in the media, the U-turn is seen more than anything as a sign. And this fundamentally causes problems. Possibly an even bigger problem for Heath, though, is when it comes to unions and industrial relations. And this is not all Heath's fault. He becomes Prime Minister, and there's plenty of disputes and strikes going on already in 1970, a hangover from the Wilson years. The dustmen end up getting a massively good pay settlement. Heath faces strikes by the dockers and the postal workers. There are power cuts because the power workers are on a go slow, only doing certain amounts of work. So he's inherited a difficult. Now, what Heath does is he introduces the Industrial Relations Act with Parliament. Now, if you remember, in place of strife, Barbara Castle's proposals that Labour ultimately rejected, this does, in many ways, what in place of strife would have done. So ballots are introduced. So if a union wants to go on strike, its members have to be they have to vote for it first. It introduces a cooling off period. So there has to be a period between a decision to go on strike and the strike beginning to allow people a chance potentially to move forwards or to change minds. It also establishes an industrial relations court where the rules are not being followed. So Heath is in many ways doing what Wilson and Castle had hoped to do. But ultimately, these get a lot of opposition. Interestingly, not just from the TUC, which represents the unions, but even the CBI, that represents the employers. There's a real sense that this is not going to solve the tensions within the workplace. And all of a sudden, we see a massive increase in strikes. Huge numbers of people in loads of different arenas: civil servants, ambulance drivers, engine drivers, firefighters, hospital staff, power workers. And if you look at 1972, almost 24 million working days lost to strikes that year. That's the highest since 1926. As you may know, 1926 was the year of the general strike. So that adds to this impression that Heath, despite all his preparation, all his image of competence, actually is really struggling here. There's a real sense that things are going horribly wrong. Most famously of all, you've got the miners' strikes in January 1972. In particular, you've got what we call flying pickets. Now, Arthur Scargill, who we'll get to know even better in the 1980s, is in charge of the Yorkshire miners at this time, and he introduces flying pickets. Basically, a picket line is where you've got your striking workers who aren't going to work, but will line up outside the workplace and try and discourage any other workers from going in. They'll be protesting. A picket line can be very peaceful. A picket line can be a pretty hostile place, particularly for anyone trying to cross it. Now, a flying picket is where you don't just get the workers from that particular mine or factory outside, you get people from those industries across the country coming to join in as well. And so flying pickets are basically being used quite a lot during this miners' strike. What it means is that it becomes increasingly difficult to move coal around the UK at all. Add to that the fact that it's a particularly harsh winter, and once again, things are really difficult for Heath, for the government, and the British people as well. There's no surprise that in February we get a state of emergency being declared, and you get a 3-day working week. Now, obviously, in the world that we're currently in 2021, a world of lockdown, things like this maybe don't seem quite as dramatic as they might have done at the time. But we get a 3-day working week, schools are closed, workplaces are only open for those 3 days, and it's all about trying to save electricity. It ends up with over 1 million workers being laid off, some temporarily, some permanently, adding once again to this impression of real crisis in the heat. So, moving from 1972 into 1973, and I've referred to this as crisis, calm, crisis. Continued crisis, we then get a little period of calm, and then the crisis emerges once again. Obviously, the miners have gone on strike, they've got a wage demand. The Wilberforce Committee is set up to investigate that wage demand, and it rules in favour of the miners. The miners' union, the NUM, manages to negotiate a pretty generous settlement. The miners, for now, are pretty happy. Now, Heath reflects on all of this and thinks, look, we've got the situation where people aren't constantly going on strike, where employers and the government and workers work collaboratively together in the interests of everybody and of the economy. And so what Heath does is he introduces and gets past the Industry Act of 1972. And what this says is the government, CBI, that's the Employers Association, the TUC, representing the unions, need to work together to agree on fixed prices and fixed wages. What is Heath doing? He's going back to consensus politics. This is a classic consensus politics. Let's get the unions and the employers in to Downing Street and thrash it out and work together. It's a U-turn. If you're Enoch Powell, if you're another right-wing conservative, if you are writing for the Daily Mail, it's another U-turn. Heath is not only presiding over chaos, he's also weak as well. Having said that, a little period of calm as we move into 1973. Unemployment's halved from 1 million down to 500,000. It also seems to be the case where the government has been putting money into modernising industry that appears to be working. Just a brief moment of calm. The crisis emerges before the end of the year. We get the firefighters going on strike, the power workers again, and then another occasion where foreign policy impacts on domestic policy. So in 1973, we've got the Yom Kippur War. This is Israel against some of the Arab nations. It just so happens that those Arab nations provide a lot of oil to Britain and the USA as well. Now, Britain and the US have supported Israel against those Arab nations. The Arab nations are part of an organisation called OPEC, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In other words, they control the supply of oil to the West. And so what they do is they impose an oil embargo. Basically, they say, we're not going to sell you oil. We're going to stop selling oil to Britain to punish Britain for its support for Israel in this Yom Kippur War. And that has a massive impact on the British economy. So oil exports have stopped. Not surprisingly, oil prices quadruple. You get massive queues going on for 3 or 4 hours at British petrol stations. And again, this is not necessarily entirely Heath's fault, but it just adds to the image of crisis and of chaos. Now, the miners, of course, sense their opportunity. They've already had a pretty good deal earlier, but now they look at it and they think, right, if we're not getting oil in, then coal once again becomes even more important. We have potentially a big bargaining chip here. If coal is so important, we could get more money here. So the miners demand another big pay rise, and the government says, look, that's way above sensible limits. That's going to just cause inflation to rise. And the miners say, fine, right, we're going to stop working, or at least we're certainly going to stop working overtime. It looks like we're heading towards another miners' strike. And so what Heath does is he appoints one of his cabinet, Willie Whitelaw, to become employment secretary. Now, Willie Whitelaw is a moderate conservative. He's quite a gentle, softly spoken man. He's been Northern Ireland secretary, so he's an expert at negotiating in difficult situations. And he thinks, look, if anybody can do this job, then Whitelaw can. Having said that, Heath recognises that even Whitelaw might fail. He's looked at the overall situation in the country, whether or not the miners go on strike, the firefighters are, the engineers already are, the dockers already are. So Heath says we're going to have to do another 3-day week. So in January 1974, we get another 3-day week, probably just as well, because Willie Whitelaw doesn't manage to achieve a deal with the miners. The miners say no to the government's pay offer. The government says, well, we're not going any higher, and there is another miners' strike. So in 1974, mirror image of 1972, we've got a miners' strike, and we've got a 3-day week. Once again, really significant impact in terms of the 3-day week. So we have fuel rationing, speed limits cut to 50 miles an hour across the country on all roads, public buildings, very swinging cuts to heating and lighting. 10:30 every night, TV is closed down. So in all sorts of aspects of life, the miners' strike and the 3-day week are having a really very significant impact. Because it is a 3-day week, you get some people working ridiculously long shifts on the 3 days when they're allowed to work. Other people simply end up out of work. And not surprisingly, because there are shortages of coal, because oil prices go up, we go back to something we saw a lot in the stop go era, which is a crisis in the balance of payments, which of course is about comparing imports, the amount we're spending on that, with the revenue coming in terms of exports. So once again, the Heath government lurching into a real period of chaos and crisis. And so what Heath does is he thinks, right, cards on the table, what are we going to do? We've got this 3-day week, we've got the miners' strike going on, we've got the impression of chaos, we're going to have a general election on the 28th of February. And Heath is very honest. He says, look, this is going to be about who governs Britain. Is it the case that the government governs Britain, or is it the case that the miners can hold us to ransom? That's what he says. He says this election is about who governs Britain. And, sadly for Heath, what the public say to him is, well, not you, because ultimately what the public do is they remove Heath from power. Now, notice my choice of words there. I haven't said they bring Wilson into power, because this election is not a massive vote of confidence in Wilson either. As you can see, what we end up with in the February 74 general election is what we call a hung parliament. A hung parliament is where no party has an overall majority. An overall majority meaning you have more seats than all the other parties put together. So as you can see, Labour gets 301, the Conservatives get 297, but given that the other parties then have another 37, yes, Labour has more seats than the Conservatives, but they don't have an overall majority. This is a hung parliament. It's an unusual situation, the first time since before World War II that this has happened in Britain. Now, the tradition is that although Heath has slightly fewer seats than Wilson, because he's been the sitting Prime Minister, he gets the first chance to form a new government. So the Queen says to Heath, look, I'll give you the opportunity to speak to the Liberal Party and to work with them. So Heath talks to Jeremy Thorpe, the Liberal leader, negotiates with Thorpe. Those negotiations come to nothing. So Heath, very reluctantly, very unhappily, but fully acknowledging democracy, leaves Downing Street. Wilson returns. Now, Wilson returns in charge of what we call a minority government, literally a government that doesn't have an overall majority. Now, minority governments, as we've seen recently with Theresa May, don't last forever. And this is certainly the case with Wilson. What we'll see in our next video is that Labour's minority government lasts for precisely 8 months. That's a story for another video. Just to summarise, though, the story of this video is very much that Heath, despite coming to power with a reasonable majority in 1970, despite having perhaps the clearest policy programme that a government has had since 1945, and despite having a huge amount of time to prepare a pretty comprehensive programme, ultimately the Heath government is characterised by crisis, by difficult industrial relations, and by significant economic.
Thank you once again to Tom for another really informative video. So lots of really good stuff there on Heath's government, their economic policies, economic problems, and again these fairly significant issues in industrial relations as well. So again, this video is part of our series looking at modern Britain 1951 to 2007, designed for ours and other A-level students to help you understand the key parts and fundamental details of the course. This runs alongside several other playlists which look at other history units. We also have a very, very comprehensive playlist looking at everything you need for A-level politics. So if you haven't done so already, then please check those out as well. Show your appreciation for Tom by hitting the like button and leaving any comments. If you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe. There's lots and lots of stuff to help you with A-level studies, or just helping you with any interest or any projects you're doing on these various history and politics subjects. Thank you very much for watching.